welcome to the Cinematologists podcast. It's Dario here. This is season number 17. We're just starting in 2023, and it's a great pleasure to welcome back my partner in crime for this odyssey of a podcast, Neil Fox. Neil, welcome back.
Hello, Dario. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be back. Thank you for welcoming me back so nicely.
No problem. You obviously came back for one episode last season for the Sight and Sound, which was a big hit for us. We kind of quadrupled our numbers on that. It was interesting to see that pan out, and I think we've gained quite a few listeners on the back of the Sight and Sound episodes. So if you are a new listener or somebody who joined around that time, then welcome. You know, you can just, as Mark Maron says, you can sit at the back and contribute when you feel confident enough to. But yeah, it's nice that that episode took place, and then a little bit of a kind of impetus for pushing forward came out of that, and it's great to start 2023 with that sort of boosting us going forward.
Yeah, it's nice to every now and again reconnect with the zeitgeist, and the film Zeitgeist was certainly all about the Sight and Sound poll. So yeah, as we mentioned before, it was an honour to be asked to contribute and to be asked to do something around the release. So yeah, and I think it's made me feel a bit less nervous about coming back, because I sort of dipped my toe in rather than come back cold, and it is cold.
Yeah, but I mean, come on, it's seasoned campaigner now at the old podcasting, and yeah, I mean it's interesting. Are you sort of kind of refreshed and ready to go again? I hope it wasn't a sort of, oh god, yeah, I've got to go back to that and get on with it kind of thing. Hopefully there was a little bit of this is good now. I've had my little break and I need to get back to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is an excitement to coming back and doing it again, and a renewed confidence. As I sort of mentioned before, I think it was on the bonus, just listening to it as a listener allowed me to comprehend the podcast in a different way, which was really nice, and see it and hear it in a different context. So yeah, I am really excited to do another season and for it to reclaim its place in my life for sure. It was really good to have the break. I needed the break and got through what I needed to get through for the most part. And yeah, it's nice to be slotting back into the podcast saddle with you in the sidecar. I don't know. That's a few metaphors mixed up there.
Yeah, no, I have to come up with some kind of partnership metaphor to describe, our journey forward. But yeah, and it'll be good to talk to you as well on the bonus. So we're going to record a after party bonus, which we were doing beforehand. For those of you who subscribe to the Patreon channel, that'll be available straight afterwards. I just want to say, with regards to that as well, a quick shout out to two new subscribers at the £2 level, and that's Harry H. Is that a comedian, Harry H? It's a good email handle, but somebody called Harry H. And then a listener called Sean Kelly. So thanks very much to you guys for joining. You get obviously access to all of our bonus content, including our monthly newsletter and the post-episode bonus podcast, which obviously, as we've just said, is coming afterwards. If you do enjoy what we do and think to yourself, yeah, I'd buy those guys a coffee if I met them in person at the cinema, then please consider supporting us. As you all know, the podcast is our labour of love, but we do have running costs, and we definitely want to keep the show ad-free going forward. So any support you can lend us is much appreciated. So today we have a much anticipated episode where we're bringing back our good friend and former colleague, now erstwhile auteur and star of British film directing, Cornwall film directing, and international film directing going forward, Mark Jenkin.
Yes, it's the Enys Men episode, and it feels really fitting to start the season off, start a new year off, focusing on Mark's latest film. And yeah, to coincide with its cinematic release. Mark, as you sort of mentioned in your conversation with him, has been here with us since the beginning, just as a listener, as a contributor, as a co-host. He's been on this journey with us from the start. So yeah, being able to welcome him back with the release of his latest film is really nice, and to kick our new season off with it feels really fitting as well. So hopefully people will enjoy this episode.
Yeah, and he gave us quite a lot of time in the middle of his opening weekend, which is pretty important, sort of going forward for his career. So that was just great to get that amount of time, really. But that's coming up. First of all, Neil, you did want to talk about a film that you'd seen recently that you think is worth having a look at.
Yeah, so just a quick mention really for a film called January, which is coming out in January. And it's been around for a couple of years, sort of doing festivals, and it's finally out in the UK in cinemas this weekend, actually, in terms of the theatrical release. The reason I wanted to mention it is a couple, really. One, it's a folk horror in the same way that Enys Men is a folk horror, in that that's a label that's been slipperily, if that's an adjective, attached to it, and does a little bit to give a sense of what the film's about, but is also kind of misleading. And also because it's co-written by Alex Barrett, who we've had on the podcast before, who made London Symphony, and it's a Bulgarian film, and it's just, it's a really wonderful movie. It reminded me of a Western, so it's got a really great setup. There's these two men and a jackdaw, which I was very pleased to see a good feature by a jackdaw in this remote landscape, sort of holed up in a hotel which feels like the Overlook Hotel, although it's completely dilapidated, and they're in a shack just off to the side, and loads of visitors arrive at this place looking for someone who's not there anymore, this character who's kind of moved on. And it reminded me of things like The Great Silence, and there's a really great Andrey Paounov film called The Day of the Outlaw, where it just feels like a Western, like, something's gonna kick off with these people arriving looking for this person who's not there. And it kind of never really pulls through on that, but that's fine, because it kind of goes in these other interesting sort of directions that sometimes they feel noiry, sometimes quite pulpy, and also kind of like, I think it's much closer to a kind of Lovecraftian cosmic horror, where there's something in the woods that is sort of playing around with sort of people, space and time, and sort of it dips into folklore here and there, but it's a really, really confident film. Looks absolutely incredible. It sort of sits somewhere between Bellatar and Genet and Caro, with this kind of really striking production design and cinematography. And it goes in a really interesting direction. There's a clue in what I've said in terms of some of the references, but I won't give it away, because it pays homage to this film and this filmmaker towards the end, in very, very direct ways. But it's a really interesting twist of form that I think is really great. And they reached out in terms of, could we do an episode on it? But obviously, with being on hiatus and coming back with Mark's film, we couldn't really fit it in. But I did want to mention it, and I think if you can catch it in the few cinemas it's in this weekend and see it on the big screen, then it's going to be a really rewarding experience.
Oh, that's great. That's a great shout out. I'll definitely look out for that.
Yeah, I think you'll really dig it.
Yeah. I mean, I always love kind of like stuff that is faux Western anyway, or out and out Western, really. And I remember I was talking to you about The English, which I really rated, as a TV show that sort of used the big cinematic tropes and just looked amazing, as a Western. But it's interesting how, what you said at the beginning there feeds into this idea of being attached, or a film being placed within a genre, and whether a filmmaker aspires to be part of a film movement, especially when there's all this talk about the idea of folk horror renaissance or gothic horror renaissance and all of that kind of stuff. So it's interesting how that does segue, to use one of our favorite words, into my conversation with Mark Jenkin, of course. And I spoke to him just yesterday down at the BFI in the green room there. Just a quick thanks to Jill Redding, the BFI press officer, for setting that up and placing me in, within his heavy schedule. Let's put it that way. But he seemed really relaxed, actually. So it was great. I think he knew that he could just sort of basically take his time and say what he wanted, which was really nice. And I went to a screening the night before, the one at the picture houses, so it was a full house there, and he did a quick Q&A afterwards. But it's one of those films that get rewarded for further viewings, I think. This is me with Mark Jenkin on Enys Men.
Are you lonely? Not really. Are you there? Can you hear me? Hello?
Welcome back to the show, Mark. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure. It's great to be here.
Obviously, I want to say, big friend of the podcast, but you're more than that. It's a sort of integral part of the show's inception back down at Falmouth. I was thinking the other day, were you at the very first live screening that we did?
What was it?
It was...
Was it Repo Man?
Yeah, it was.
No, I wasn't. But I remember listening to that podcast, so I must have been... Yeah, I think I wasn't at the screening, but I was already waiting to hear it. Because I remember you talking about it originally with Neil, and it was going to be a radio show.
Oh, yeah.
And then Mark Douglas from Falmouth University was going to be involved, and and then it became a podcast at a time when I hadn't really got my head around podcasts. I thought, oh wow, is it? Oh no, it's not going to be a radio show. It's going to be a podcast. Yeah. That's it's going to be it's going to have much less reach. Yeah. And then not really appreciating what podcasts. Well, they probably already were huge. They just weren't on my radar.
Well, I mean, it was around 2014-15, so it was when Serial was happening, and suddenly everybody kind of realised.
Well, see, I didn't listen to Serial until I was hand processing the all of the negative for Bait.
Oh right,
that was when I got into that.
Fantastic. So it was kind of like something on the background then as you were doing the process.
Yeah, I just got through so much. I hate to use the word content, but I got through a lot of stuff in the studio because I was just in the studio 8 or 9 hours a day. Yeah. So I was just looking for recommendations, and I would just see on Twitter what everybody else was doing, and gradually caught up with pop culture for a while. Lost track of it again soon afterwards, but
you didn't have to do that for this film, for Enys Men, did you? I mean, did you miss that a little bit? The fact that you had total control of the entire process?
I didn't know, because I worked out a way of having some control over the way the neg looked, even though the lab were processing it. But I think what I did miss was the distance that the hand processing gave me, because we finished Bait, and then I spent 3 months processing the neg. So I didn't see a moving image at all from the footage until Christmas, and we'd finished shooting in like October. And so when I did see the moving footage, I had that distance, and it felt quite new.
Yeah.
And that really informed the edit. And this time, by the end of the shoot, I had all of the footage. So that then I had to work some distance into the process by saying, right, I'm not going to watch anything for a couple of weeks and then come back to it. Whereas on Bait, it was enforced. And I think the one thing that's really valuable when you're making a film is distance. But distance is really time or other people. So you can get distance by, say, working with an editor, or you can get distance by not looking at any footage for 3 months. And because I do a lot of stuff myself, I don't get any distance through other people doing stuff. I also, on this one, didn't have any distance through time, except for what I sort of wrote into the schedule. And once a film's into production, everything's such a race to get to the end. Nobody ever schedules in like, right, we're gonna shoot, then we're gonna do nothing on it for 6 months. And I think a lot of films would be actually improved by that, but you would never. There's no way of scheduling that into a production of a film.
Well, it was interesting what you were saying the other night in the Pitch Houses Q&A about being in two minds about how influenced you were by the rushes that you did have this time.
Yeah,
and the idea of building that feeds in the process to what the film's about in many ways in terms of time and distancing and isolation and what have you.
Yeah. So we sent off the negative twice a week while we were shooting, and then we'd get rushes back to look at, and it had pros and cons. The overwhelming pros was that we could see that that the camera was working on a very basic level, and that the production design that we were going after was working well. So Joe and May and the production design team, I would show them they would look at the footage because they wanted to see how their work was looking. I think Mary was less inclined to look, because she didn't want to be distracted in what she was doing on screen.
And then it would have been a real doppelganger as well in terms of seeing herself in two ways. It's really weird when you think about how the process feeds into the themes of the film.
Yeah, and once you've established the way you want to work, it's really important not to compromise that. And I couldn't help but look at the footage. But the first couple of batches that came back, I looked at in forensic detail, and then by the sort of third lot that came back, what I was doing was really just scanning through it at high speed just to check focus, exposure, things like that, and not getting obsessed with the content of it, because I knew that it would inform how I was going to shoot the rest of the film, and I might end up with a sort of head, bod, leg version of a film that was sort of changing through what I was looking at, and I was sleep deprived and sort of in a state of kind of mild panic most of the time, and I think that's a good state to be in to make creative decisions when you're shooting. It's not a good state to be in to analyze the effectiveness of what you've done when you're looking at it on a tiny screen with no sound and you're worrying about the next day.
So I found this fascinating in and of itself, but then as a follow-up to Bait, but then also on so many different, technical, genre, cultural context, and other levels, even kind of metaphysical, ideas that are in there. So how far does the idea for this film go back? Is it pre-Bait? I mean, obviously we can talk about the relationship to COVID, but where is it in the sort of timeline of your creative output?
It's post-Bait. And I should give credit to Adrian Bailey, the writer, who me and him came up with the original story idea, and then I wanted to take it in a very specific way. So I took the idea and then created the screenplay. But the original idea, which was based around making a genre film with a single protagonist and it being set on an island. That was mine and Adrian's idea that we kind of cooked up together. What happened was that the success of Bait made it made me think about what I needed to do next in a much more focused way than I'd ever thought before.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And I think the decision, I got offered a lot of stuff. I got called in for meetings and I got asked, did I want to do this? Did I want to do that? Here's a book, here's a screenplay, attach yourself to this and that. All really flattering stuff. My ego was like saying, yeah, go on, do that with those people. And, this is a big thing. And the temptation to do that was really overwhelming. But I think in conversation with Denzel Monk, the producer, and with Matthew Bates, who's my agent, we decided that it was really important just to reinforce what had happened with Bait, because Bait was such an anomaly not in terms of my work, but sort of the British film industry. I think that it was important just to reinforce what that had done in a way, and just do another film, another small film, and do it quickly and do it without drawing too much attention to us. But parallel to that, a lot of people had been talking about Bait and what kind of film it was, and obviously the formal aspect of it was getting a lot of attention.
Sure.
But also people were saying it felt like a horror film. When they were writing about it, it had this sense of the uncanny and the foreboding over it, hanging over elements of the film. And I took that really as an invitation to make a genre film, which I found really attractive, because when we were trying to get Bait made, it was difficult to pitch. I'm terrible at pitching my ideas anyway, but when you're trying to raise money, saying we want to do this film, and people would say, what is it?
Yeah, I was reading, sorry to interrupt, but I was reading about your aversion to kind of genre categories, but I can imagine if you go into a room and say, I want to make a Cornish surrealist folk horror, it's like that is a narrow kind of niche in a way.
But that was easier than pitching Bait. When you say,
okay, that's interesting.
When you say, what film are you making in relation to Bait, and I'd say, it's a drama, and people go, oh. Yeah. Oh, cool. And then I'd say, no, but it's it's black and white, it's 16mm, it's hand processed, it's post synced, and it's about Cornish fishermen. And still, you're in an area where people aren't getting massively excited. And then once you've made the film, once we'd made it, and then people were saying, have you seen this black and white 16mm hand processed post synced film about Cornish fishermen? It's amazing. You have to sort of do the film to to sort of do justice to the pitch. So I was excited by the idea of people saying, oh yeah, so you've done Bait, what are you doing next? And just be able to go, I'm doing a horror film. Now, I think on reflection, I don't know whether we've made a horror film. And I think certainly calling it a horror film might be a mistake, because it might disappoint out and out horror fans.
Sure.
And it might put off audiences who don't like horror.
That's the thing about genre, though, isn't it? It's kind of like everybody's got a kind of ownership over what horror should be.
Yeah.
And then they'll make their decisions whether they like it or not based on that.
Yeah. And then because I think I never really thought of myself growing up as a horror fan, because I had preconceptions of what a horror film was. But then as I got older and thought, actually, I am a horror fan.
Yeah.
Most of my films that I really like can be defined as horror films, like a lot of cinema, really. So yeah, so that was a starting point. I think, right, we can write I can write a script that is a genre film. It's a horror, and so I wrote it very quickly, and I always write pen and paper. So first draft is pen and paper, then I type that up, and that becomes a sort of, I call that the first draft, but it's already a second draft, because I change things as I type it up. And I read it back and just thought, wow, this isn't a horror film. There's no horror in the content. And then I thought, well, the people always said Bait felt like a horror film, and that was to do with the form. So it suddenly made me realize why people thought Bait felt like a horror film, and it made me realize how Enys Men could be a kind of horror film without it necessarily being on the page.
I mean, you could write in your head a romantic comedy and then turn it into a horror movie in the form, just the way you sound it or shoot it.
It's like that trailer for you seen that trailer that's on YouTube for The Shining?
Yeah, that's right.
Where they've put the Peter Gabriel track on it and turned it and put the voiceover and turned it into a family.
And there's that one of Star Wars as well, with the horror trailer for Star Wars.
Right. Yeah. So you can. I mean, the form is as important as the content. I think not enough films acknowledged, or filmmakers acknowledge that. And if you do, you know, like, I've been called a formalist filmmaker, and I suppose in the modern context, I am, because I mean, as interested in the form as I am the content. And the danger is you don't get accused of being style over content, which I think is problematic if it's style over content. But form has got to be as important as the content.
There's an article that literally just came out sort of about 50 minutes ago in The Independent, placing this film in this renaissance, let's say, of folk horror, you know, maybe started by Midsummer, but The Witch, you know, Robert Eggers' work. I mean, was that something that was in the back of your mind about there is a wave of these films that is coming out now, and, you know, were you interested in where it fits in that regard?
No, I didn't. I mean, I loved The Witch, and I love Robert's work. I love what he does. I didn't really think of it, because I didn't. When we were making the film, we were never thinking of it as a folk horror.
Right.
Because my idea of folk horror was so narrow that I probably wouldn't have thought of the Witch as a folk horror. I was sort of so obsessed with the sort of English folk horror, which I was quite wary of, because I didn't want to be sort of associated with that, which was The Wicker Man and Blood on Satan's Claw and Witchfinder General, that, you know, the so-called unholy trinity that actually started off really distancing myself from that folk horror, because I wanted to do something that was Cornish, distinctly Cornish, and that meant sort of rejecting the English folk horror, the pastoral merry old England, which is something I find in the modern context now is a really dangerous vision of England, an imagined version that certain people seem to want to go back to. You know, a made-up version of England.
It's funny, because all of those kinds of films, I've seen them all, I'm aware of them. It's not my kind of thing, and I'm really interested, though, how that fits into sort of, you know, a political little Englander mentality in some ways.
That's what I'm scared of, is the little Englander mentality. I know that, like, probably the most prominent of the unholy trilogy is The Wicker Man, which is Scottish, but that feels very. It's like there's a lot of England in that version of Scotland, or that in that film. I feel so. I was defining what we were doing by what we were not. So I was saying we're not English folk horror. So I didn't want to use that term. And then I watched that brilliant folk horror documentary that I can never remember the name of, that Kingsley Marshall at the School of Film and Television gave me the DVD, and he said, "Oh, check this out." And so I watched it, and I thought it was all going to be about the Unholy Trilogy, but the documentary's really long, and I thought, oh wow, this is going to be a deep dive into those 3 films. And then I watched it, and it's about folk horror from all over the world,
right?
And it was really enlightening, because I suddenly realised, well, everybody's got a folk history. Most people who've got a folk history have got a cinema that's attached to it.
Yeah.
And then, and the realisation that a film like Oni Baba is a folk horror. And then I was able to, myself and Denzel were like, well, we can do folk horror, and we can be Cornish folk horror.
Yeah.
So we can define this film and ourselves by what we are, not by what we're not, which is a much healthier way to identify yourself. So I went on a real journey, not just in terms of how to define the film, but I felt really refreshed by being able to define myself by what I am and what I'm not. So it was like, this is Cornish, and it's a Cornish folk horror, and it's part of an international, huge cinematic lineage that is, continuing all the time. And I don't have to say we're not this. You could just say we are this, and this is our contribution to that huge body of work. And and maybe we're the first Cornish folk horror. Maybe we're not. I don't, because defining folk horror in the first place is so complicated that maybe there are other Cornish folk horrors, and maybe Bait was the first Cornish folk horror, because in some ways it fits the definition of a folk horror more than Enys Men does. The idea of people coming in and and the problems of the people coming from an urban area to a rural or coastal area. Bait does fit some definitions of folk horror more than Enys Men does.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of horror as well that is rural but not necessarily folk. You know what I mean? Just that kind of setting and the idea of isolation in a sense, but it not really reaching back to kind of oldie world paganism or whatever. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think sometimes the sort of urban perspective of the countryside is that there's a fear that is sort of, more about the person coming from the city than it is about the people in the rural or coastal area, because there's distinctions between the way people live and people's expectations, and even some differences in morality and things like that. But actually, despite being different in terms of the way we live, we're actually all the same.
Yeah. And scared of the same shit a lot of the time.
Well, and it all comes from fear, and then you invent these demons and monsters that aren't really there.
Yeah. Mary Woodvine, obviously, is the lead and is your partner as well. Yeah. So was she always going to be the protagonist? Did you write it with her in mind? And, was that even like a deal breaker in terms of the, pre-production and stuff like that,
We had a protracted casting process.
Okay.
Where I didn't want to cast Mary in it because I didn't want to be, it seemed too convenient. I didn't want to be accused of nepotism. And in fact, I saw something online the other day. The woman who did the woodcut picture that's featured in the film, her surname is Jenkins. And I saw something online. Somebody asked about the woodcut, and somebody replied to it. I think it was on Twitter, and they said, "Oh no, the woodcut's done by his wife."
Just somebody making up some bullshit.
Everything's done within, But I mean, it's promoted so much that I do so much of the film. It's kind of expected. But this person was saying, "Oh no, it's all done sort of in-house kind of thing." So right from the beginning, I was worried that I didn't want to be accused of being nepotistic. So I resisted casting Mary in the film, and at times she was actually acting as like a casting director, because she was suggesting her own peers as potentials to play the role. And we were going really around the houses, and I was thinking about different people, and nobody ever seemed right, and Denzel was just sort of like waiting for a kind of decision for me to make up my mind about casting or to put together a short list. And then one day I just thought, well, I've written this for Mary. You don't live with somebody who's an actor, and then you write a female character who looks and sounds like your partner and is the center of the film. And so I just said to Denzel, I think it should be Mary. And he was a bit like, good. At last. The elephant in the room has been dealt with. And and I'd obviously written it for her. And I spend a lot of time saying that I don't think about the audience, and I try and just work on a gut level, and I try and avoid any kind of allowing myself any kind of outside interference in the creative process. But I think that's I've found many examples in this process, but I think that's one of many examples of time where I was worried about what other people were thinking. And maybe if Bait hadn't put me in a certain bit of limelight, I wouldn't have been thinking that, and I would have cast Mary straight away, and we would have, got on with it quicker. But I do think I was slightly aware of how that was going to be perceived. But as soon as the decision was made, I can't imagine it not being Mary. And also, we couldn't have made it. I couldn't have made it if it wasn't for Mary, because we got a shorthand. I know what she can do, and I know how to get the sort of the best out of her. And part of that is because I wrote it for her.
Yeah. So obviously, being together, you'll see things that she can bring. But then I was just wondering, now it's finished and you're looking back at the performance on screen as objective way as you possibly can. What is her final performance like for you? How do you feel about it? I mean, to me, she brings not really a sense of terror like in the sort of trite final girl type thing, but it's almost a kind of introspection, like how is my mind working here, is almost kind of what she's asking herself all the time. That's what I kind of got from it.
Yeah, well, there's no backstory in the script. There's no context of why she's there in the screenplay. And she asked me certain questions about what her motivation is, and I would always throw the questions back to her. Some things I would answer, but the thing is, when I write a screenplay, all the characters are just me. I can't, they're all, any writer only writes versions of themselves. Even if they're writing an existing person, even me writing a character for Mary, it's not Mary. The character isn't Mary, but I was writing a character that I knew Mary could play. But that character's still a version of me, and I've got a distinct personality, as we all do, which is an introvert. I'm a classic introvert. I've got some extrovert tendencies, but at the heart of it, I'm an introvert. So that character, although I was writing it for Mary, who is a classic extrovert and is as extroverted as I am introverted, the character on the page is an introvert. And so then Mary comes in and 50% of it is going to be her, or more than that probably, because I've put no context or backstory in. So she brings in an introvert as the actor, portraying, she comes in as an extrovert portraying an introverted character. So it becomes fleshed out. And then so when I look at that character, it's like there's a complexity there, because it's like an extrovert trying to break out of an introvert. But also I never put adjectives and adverbs into my screenplays. I never describe motivation. I never say the volunteer walks into the room, she crosses the room cautiously. Some scripts you see, she's thinking back to what, she's thinking back to what she just experienced on the cliff, and you think, how the hell do you act that? And also, as a writer or as a filmmaker, why would you want to close off all the possibilities that the actor brings that you can't imagine? You bring an actor in with all of their craft, all of their human experience, all of their preconceptions. That's when the characters become multifaceted. So the script has got so little, all of my scripts, so little motivation for the characters, because I want the actors to bring that, and there'll be discussions before the camera's rolling, but I want to be surprised by what they bring, because up until that point, all the characters are just versions of me. In Enys Men, it's even another level, because not only did I want an actor going through the process of trying to discover what the character is, I also, on the screen, wanted the character to be going through the process of working out who the character is. So then what you get is this sort of kind of thoughtfulness. And my favourite bits of the film is where Mary's character is kind of almost like ambivalent to terror.
Yeah.
Because that's really confusing.
Yeah.
And I remember when I wrote the script, I showed it to my friend Gweno, read it, and I remember we'd been to a screening, or I'd done a talk, and she'd come along, and she was just happened to be in London, and we were walking to the bus, and she was going one way and I was going the other way, and we were talking about the script, and she said just one thing. She said, it's not going to be like Mary being terrorized and chased around the island in a 90 for an hour and a half. And I said, no, absolutely not. The film formally is like influenced by the 1970s sort of genre cinema,
Sure.
But content-wise, it's not. It's nothing to do with that sort of like a terrorized lone woman in an IT being chased around. But Gweno's words really stayed with me, and at times I did think, when at times when Mary was being terrorized, I would think back to what she'd said and think, is this? Am I falling into those kind of tropes? And
no, I think it stays out. It stays out of that, because I think what's happening is that, to me, and I'll come to my sort of overview reading in a minute, but this is a character who actually does have almost an agency on the fact that she's going through an experience that she's at the center of. I mean, maybe there's some working out about whether it's psychological, whether it's kind of imagined, hallucinatory, all of those kind of things. And also, to do with memory and all that kind of stuff. But you never get the sense, I don't think, that there's a kind of like a physical monster or something that's out to get her in that thing. So that's where it becomes a kind of psychogeography in many ways.
And if there's a monster, it's the monster that's sort of within her, which I think is, that never consumes her, really.
Yeah. Now, obviously, sound is such an important factor here. And, you could argue that sound should be thought of as 50% of every film in terms of the cinematic experience. And the post-syncing that you do obviously gives you a lot of control over the sound design. But how much of a clear sense of, say, the symbolism of the sound or the textuality of the sound in terms of how it's going to drive things forward is in your head beforehand or as you shoot, and how much is just, that's part of the joys of the editing process afterwards that you've talked about?
I think it is it's the joy of the editing process that I can chuck a sound alongside a picture that I think was going to work, and it doesn't work, and then I have to find something else. The sound, I'm always thinking about the soundtrack. I don't mean the score soundtrack, but the sound of the film. I'm always thinking about it, but I don't know how it will work until it's in relation to the picture, because the sound cannot exist in isolation in the way that the picture can't work in isolation. So I can look at some silent rushes and think, that's not working. But I know that if I do something with the audio, that will work. And sometimes I'll look at a visual and think, wow, that looks great. Once I do the audio work on it, it's going to just go through the roof. And actually, when I come to put the audio work on it, it doesn't work, and what I end up with silence. So I can't consider picture without sound, and I can't consider sound without picture. And that's why I do the whole thing at the same time. So as soon as I start cutting the picture, I'm cutting the sound.
Sure.
And even more so in this film, where you haven't got dialogue to dictate rhythm, I'm doing Foley right from the start. So, first day of the edit, I'm already recording footsteps.
You literally just kind of stop and I'm like, I'm going to have to go find a sound now that goes in there.
Yeah,
right.
Most of it I do in the studio.
Yeah.
And then I'll put together a list, and I'll put placeholders in, and then I'll have a list of stuff that I need to go out and record. And then that's such a joyous experience, because I go out with a hard disk recorder and or sometimes even a tape recorder and a microphone. I just go out and collect sound effects, and that's just really joyous. And you're right, it is 50% of any film, but if you're working on with very low budget, it becomes more than that, because without being cynical about it, it's cheap. Creating the sound world of a film costs a lot less money than creating the visual side of the world, which is why I don't record any sound on location, because I don't want to waste any of that. I can do the sound later, was my original thought when I started working in this way. Let's just get the pictures, get the expensive bit, the bit that we can completely control, and I'll deal with the sound later. We haven't got time to stop to wait for an airplane to go past. I don't think we have the right to turn up in a location and then demand that the residents in the location all be quiet. I don't want to be that You know, I haven't got the personality to be that sort of, to have that conversation with people. I want to be really light touch. And you can shoot visually without causing much disruption, because, you know, if it's really busy and you need people to be out of the way, then you move the camera closer to the subject. You make the frame smaller, and don't record any audio, because then you don't have to ask people to shut up. And that's why, through that thinking, I've ended up with my films have big close-ups, because I move the camera closer to the subject to remove anything that's incongruous within the frame, and they're post-synced. And that's now become sort of like an artistic consideration rather than a logistical one.
That kind of leads on to my next question, which is kind of involved, and I don't want to, well, maybe this will trigger what you said the other day about, you know, the anxiety about lack of media training that somebody accused you of, which is kind of interesting. But like, just on what you've said there, I mean, we interviewed Michel Chion, you know, last year on the podcast, and obviously he's written a lot of theoretical books on cinematic sound, particularly related to your use of acousmatic sound or disembodied sound here as a vital in the film in building the psychological mood. But then you also use it symbolically and experimentally. And like I say, without sort of framing this as a, do you actually know what you're doing, Mark, kind of question, are all of these sound elements part of a coherent intentionality? Or is part of this also just, you want to play with abstraction? Like, for example, the seagull drops into the water and it's breaking glass, you know, as a symbolic element.
That's the perfect example, actually, because I was, at that point in the film, that part of the process, I'm trying to create naturalistic sound as much as possible, and then I'll subvert it in one way or another. So I start with nothing, which is a brilliant starting point, I think, because quite often with low budget film, the first thing you do in the sound is mend things. You know, so how can we get rid of the sound of this aeroplane that's on, you know, the dialogue track, or, you know, and it's all this kind of stuff. If you start with nothing, you've got nothing to fix, which I think is a much better starting point for a creative process. So that scene with the diving gannet, I was trying to recreate the sound effect of the gannet hitting the water. So it dives and it breaks the surface of the water at something like 70 miles an hour. So I needed a sound effect that was a gannet breaking the surface of the water at 70 miles an hour, recorded from about half a kilometre away, which is a really specific soundtrack. I'm not going to find that soundtrack in a sound effects library, for example. I could go out and I could try and recreate, or not recreate it, but I could record the sound of a gannet flying if I went and sat on the cliff for another 2 weeks waiting to get the
hypersensitive directional microphone.
Yeah, exactly. But then what I did was, I'll recreate it in the studio. So there I am with a bucket of water and a stone, and playing with distance of microphones and playing with reverb and echo and, you know, and shielding the mic and all this kind of stuff. It just all sounded like so crap and like an attempt at realism that I just couldn't achieve. So then one day I just thought, bollocks to it. I cannot do it. I cannot get it natural. I'm not going to get a realistic sound. So what else can I do with it? And I thought, well, I'll just have a call forward to something that happens later in the film, which is the smashing glass, and just drop a sound effect of smashing glass over it. And then it solves the problem, but it also creates something that's then adds to the kind of atmosphere of the film, a level of abstraction, a level of foreboding. Not everybody hears that sound either. And then like I say, you know, because I've started with nothing, I have to create something. And then if I can't create it, I have to use my imagination. And the more you can be forced to use your imagination, the more distinct your work's going to be. But I follow my gut, you know, I'll drop a sound on it. And the second I listen to it back, I'll say yes or no. You know, Ginsberg's first thought, best thought. That's what I go with all the time. So there's no sort of intellectual idea about what I'm doing. I'm just following my gut. And some of it's just being playful, you know, and you know, just thinking, what would happen if I drop this on it or drop that on it? Knowing full well that I don't have, you know, I'm not performing this live, so I don't have to get it right first time. I can try it. If it doesn't work, then I'll try something else.
I've read quite a few of the interviews and seen a couple of the Q&As, now one live and the one that you did with Mark Kermode. And there's always a variation of the question. Bait was black and white, and this one is colour. So I'm trying to figure out a way to talk about that without being so obvious, but it does look so vibrant. And it's a bit speculative to ask you whether you think maybe in the digital age, have audiences somehow lost an appreciation of color. But for you as a film watcher, are you kind of dissatisfied with the use of color in contemporary cinema? I mean, you and I have talked about the sort of blue tinge
Quite a bit in the past, you know.
Yeah, what do they call it? Orange and teal.
Yeah.
that grade that became. I don't know I don't know whether we've got past that or not now, but it certainly
Maybe.
was. Every film was kind of orange and teal, and it was to do with contrasting colours and had a lot of colour science theory behind it. Yeah, I mean, some of it's to do with presentation of films. I think one of the projectionists I spoke to said, when we were getting the 35mm print of Enys Men made, he said, "Oh yeah, well he said DCPs are fine, but DCP is the pastel version of your film. What if you've got the 35mm print? That'll be the true version of it. And seeing the 35mm print, it looks exactly like we saw it in the grading suite, whereas the DCP does sort of take the edges off the vibrancy a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know. I mean, I try not to get too into sort of film versus digital because I haven't seen the movie yet, but I've seen the trailer for Empire of Light, for example, and you see what Roger Deakins does with digital technology, and just go, well, I mean, it just looks absolutely incredible. And they're a bad looking digital films, and there are bad looking films that are shot on film, and I do think they look different. I mean, we're sat behind with there's a poster behind you for The Living and the Dead, which is a BBC One TV series, which is a ghost story, which I actually picked as part of my season that I'm curating here. I think episode 2 of that series, which was on the surface seemed like quite a random choice to put in, and I paired it with Haunters of the Deep, which is a 1984 Cornish set Children's Film Foundation movie. But The Living and the Dead, I mean, that's shot digitally, and it's beautiful because it's tried to successfully digitally replicated a sort of 2-strip Technicolor process of the time. And so I think if there's a lot of thought that goes into the way a film's looking, then digital films can look incredible. And like Ida.
It's amazing. Yeah, and the other one, the Cold War as well. Yeah.
Sorry, both those films, and actually Cold War, which one of my amazing favorite films of recent times.
Sure.
And black and white digital, which I was always really skeptical about, but that looks so beautiful, that film. So I think it's to do with, I think when you get led by the sort of technology and sort of the contemporary standard of cameras or whatever, I think sometimes it seems that people don't consider the form as much, whereas if you're sort of using technology that's perceived as being obsolete or old-fashioned, then I think automatically there's a reason why you've chosen it, but also you have to sort of justify its use, and then you're really aware of the form, whereas it's sort of just an automatic thing, it seems, a lot of the time. There's not enough conversation about form, I don't think, when you're developing a project. You spend months talking about the script, and everybody's got an opinion about the script, and quite rightly so. Everything's sort of tested within a script, and then when the script's signed off, it's then like the formal discussion seems to be absent, really. And sometimes I think it's because people don't feel they know enough to sort of have an opinion, but that shouldn't stop people from asking questions.
It's interesting, though, you're talking about yourself as a formalist, and Neil and I were discussing, not on the podcast actually, we were just talking about the way in which it's critically out of fashion now to like films or to really laud films that have a very clear directorial intervention. So people like Inarritu and Tarantino, whether or not you like their films or not, they have a formal hallmark, and it's much more now part of the zeitgeist, I think, in critical circles to like films that are much more minimalist / realist. Yeah. And I wonder whether that is kind of maybe on the verge of coming back, that sort of sense of, this is just great because it looks great and it does amazing things with what cinema can do,
Yeah, I hope so. Because I think there's a place for everything. But I do... Yeah, I'm not interested in realism as a filmmaker. As an audience member, I'm really interested in it.
Sure.
And I'm an audience member much more often than I'm a filmmaker. I watch a lot more films than I make. so I there's definitely room for everything, and sort of diversity of work should be really encouraged. But I do get a bit sort of I do get a bit disappointed when people can write something off and go, well, it's just about the form. And it's like, yeah, but film's a mechanical art form. You can't ignore the fact that it's a film. And actually, maybe sometimes I go too far the other way, but I like celebrating the fact that you're watching a film. So I like reminding people, our eyes don't crash zoom, but I love a crash zoom, and I love the vibrant color, and I like and I like grain, and I like the image almost falling apart, and I like characters who break the fourth wall, and I love just celebrating that form, not because I just want all of my films to be like an advert for cinema, but because I think it works so well in two ways. One, I'm obsessed with our suspension of disbelief, which I can never work out whether it's because we're really intelligent that our suspension of disbelief is so brilliant, or whether we're just really thick, that you can be sort of caught up with something that's so clearly artificial. But I love how the fact that the artifice doesn't really affect your going with the film or not. And
it's the moment when the intellectualization of film falls apart, when you just go, we're all just monkeys staring at the screen. You know what I mean?
Yeah. We've decided to go to the cinema. We've then decided what thing to see, and then we've walked up, paid for it. We've walked into a really artificial space where somebody's then turned the lights off, and then we stare at a screen, and then some light hits the screen, and then we all go, oh my God! Are we really sophisticated, or are we really stupid? But whatever it is, it's brilliant. And I love that. If I want to celebrate the form as much as I want to communicate the content, because you can't have one without the other. If I could do that verbally or with the written word, if I could tell the stories I wanted to tell, or more specifically create the atmospheres that I want to create, I would do it through sort of verbal storytelling or by writing, because I think that feels easier than having to go through the whole mechanical process of making a film. But I can't do it. There are amazing writers and who I'm completely in awe of, and the great poets who you just read something and go, oh God, how did he just do that? Somebody, David Spittle, who's a writer who's up in the Northeast, who interviewed me, and he's featuring me in a book he's writing. I met him in Newcastle the other day, and he gave me an envelope that had a book of his in, and a card he'd made me. And also what I hadn't noticed in the envelope was a little book, which was A Shropshire Lad, an old, a little edition of a Shropshire Lad written by A.E. Housman, who's like one of my favourite poets. Sure. And that, I just was looking at the envelope earlier, and that dropped down. I just thought, I just love Housman because of the atmosphere that he can create with, one of my favourite poems, which is the Into My Heart and Air That Kills, which Rogue used at the end of Walkabout, which was like one of a really important film for me. 8 lines that poem is, and it's just the whole world. If I could get anywhere near creating that atmosphere with words alone, I wouldn't make films. I'd be doing that. But films are the way that I feel I can create the atmospheres that I want to communicate, and as much of that is about the form as it is the content, which in the story I always tell is that it's about the dream state. It's about the language of the unconscious, the subconscious, or even the conscious, the non-linear, non-plot driven way that our minds work. And the thing I always say is about try and explain a dream you've had to somebody. It is impossible. Don't when you wake up and go, oh, I've had this amazing dream, or somebody, says to me, I had an amazing dream last night, and you think, oh my God, they're just about to try and explain it to me. This is going to be excruciating. And it's either the most boring thing you've ever listened to, or it just sounds like that person's making it up. And it's because you are trying, unless you're a poet or an amazing writer or amazing with language, you're not going to be able to do justice to what you experienced in your unconscious or subconscious with language alone. You need film to do that, because dreams are atmosphere led. They're not plot driven.
It seems a bit trite now to sort of hit you with my prosaic this is what this film means outline, but I know, without getting into,
No, I really like this, because I know that you know that I'm just going to listen to this and offer no opinion on it whatsoever.
Right. Well, you can. I don't want to know whether you think it's right. That's just ridiculous. But what it maybe leads you to leads us to talk about a little bit more. So, and it aligns very much with my sort of interest in sci-fi rather than folk horror. Let's say, going back to the genre discussion. But for me, I just felt like Mary is the last woman on Earth, like in an Omega Man scenario, or Omega Woman scenario as it is. So every contact that she has with a human being, and when I'm saying that, even the radio messages, all of this is imagined, right?
Yeah. And
when we're talking about, with the relationship with the fisherman, whether it's a husband or partner or just someone that she has a relationship with, or with whether it's her daughter or herself or a combination of the two, all of these things are imaginings or hallucinations. It doesn't really matter which. They could be like physical hallucinations or psychological imaginings, right?
Yeah.
But these are happening because she's so alone, she's beginning to lose a grip on time and space.
Yeah.
And you talked about that idea of, when if you think about COVID, when we're alone, like that idea of, it feels like we've been doing this for weeks, and really it's been days and that kind of stuff. So if you were alone in the world and your concept of reality starts to break down, what might be a way that you could retain that grip? You might start recording things that happen just to remind yourself of your relationship to your physical reality, i.e. writing down things that happen to plants or in nature that are around you, or dropping a stone into down a mine shaft, just to hear that sound, to think, okay, space and time still kind of correlates to my experience, right?
Yeah.
So she's not taking readings as part of a scientific study or anything like that, as we may infer. It's kind of grounding her material reality. But as that starts to break down psychologically, she starts to be able to be in tune with the way that nature and buildings have a kind of internal or cosmological energy. So her thoughts about her own past, and whether it's herself or a memory of her daughter, kind of are aligning with the past of everything that's going on around her. So this is why she can now start to see that mine shaft had miners in it at one point, and the ocean and all of the deaths that have occurred kind of correlate to her own experience of the ocean and this kind of thing. Yeah. So she suddenly, because she's totally alone, has this, like I say, sort of cosmic sympathy with the land and everything around her. So it's almost, and part of that is it's a kind of fabulous evocation of Freud's doppelganger. I mean, we talked a little bit about that. Where the familiar becomes terrifying.
Yeah.
So all of that is going on. So then it reminded me then of other. I mean, I know you've done this series, the DNA of Enys Men, but like this really made me think of something like Memoria, which I don't know if you've seen yet.
I haven't. No, it's on my it's on my watch list. Right. And actually, I put it on my watch list because I saw I think you published a reaction to it, and
well, as soon as you watch that movie, give us a call and we'll tape an immediate reaction, because I'd love to see what you think about this. In relationship
cool.
In relationship to this film, but even films like Arrival, where
Arrival's great.
Yeah, where the central character can kind of manifest the past and the future.
Yeah,
because of the language that she's given. I mean, obviously there's no aliens coming down here, but in a similar way, Mary can manifest the future and the past because of her aloneness. And then other films like La Jetée or A Ghost Story, which are time travel movies. So there's this sort of way into, I think, the sci-fi genre because of this scenario that you've put the central character in.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I know it's not part of your intention, but do you see that reading though in the film?
Yeah, I mean, aspects of it. Yeah, and I think that sort of trying to keep hold of reality and the kind of routine element to it. And it's interesting you saying that the flower, maybe the flower isn't a sort of biological study. It's just keeping an eye on something to see how something's changing so you can keep track of time. Yeah. I think that's really interesting in relation to the pandemic, because what I think the effect the pandemic had on the film for me was that we filmed it in March and April 2021 when we were actually going to shoot it in April and May 2020. But we got delayed by a year, and then I said to Denzel, let's move it forward a month. Let's shoot it in March and April. And the reason we did that was because during that lockdown in 2020, me and Mary and Morgan, our family, we would go out into a field out the back of our house, which a farmer had allowed us, or landowner had allowed us to sort of use. People in the village who didn't have a garden would go out and hang around this field to do our sort of daily exercise. And what I noticed was the season change. Winter turned into spring, almost minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. Because we were doing the same thing, we saw it change. So it was like, oh, look at this coming out, look at that, the blackthorn or the hawthorn or the daffs have gone, or, whatever was coming out. We saw it in detail, and I didn't write it down, but I was so preoccupied by it, because I thought this is like when I was at primary school, when in the summer term or the spring term, you do a project where you'd measure the rainfall each day and the temperature and write it on the wall in the classroom. I thought, I'm watching a season change in a way that I haven't done for 40 years, and that became really important, watching that. And I thought, God, spring comes really early now. Spring comes in March. And I said to Denzel, when we film, because by the end of March 2020, all the flowers were, everything was out. It was spring. I said to Denzel, when we film next year, we've got to shoot earlier, because spring happens earlier these days. What actually happened was that in 2021, spring reverted to its traditional time of year, and it didn't actually come out until after we'd finished shooting. So I think that is interesting, because that did tap into what I think I was going through in the pandemic, which was almost like it wasn't like I felt like I was the last person on earth, but it certainly felt not post-apocalyptic. It felt apocalyptic, because can you actually have post-apocalyptic? But it did feel a little bit like this is. It felt like a moment that we were all going through, and routine. I don't know if I talked about this in the Q&A that you were at, but routine became so important. And that was, I see, in order to stay sane, routine was the framework that we built everything around, which I think is in, although the script was written a long time before the pandemic, I think that really came to the fore during the rewrite post the first lockdown that I did, through the shooting of the film, which was done during the lockdown, but was a bit of a paradox, because we were in lockdown, but we were making a film together. And so although everybody was in lockdown, we were all together in a way that we hadn't been together for a long time. So that definitely influenced what I was shooting and how I was shooting stuff. Even, the social distancing meant that certain shots weren't how I'd imagined them. Sure. So the pandemic is in there. And then in the edit, recognizing the importance of that routine and what happens if a routine becomes subverted, or how important a routine becomes if your existence has been subverted in some way.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark, for giving us so much time. This is absolutely fantastic. I've heard a lot of stuff that you've said at different points, and we had a chat at London Film Festival and stuff. And going back to that, and reflecting on the fact that this is the opening weekend, and I'm not bothered about what Spider-Man 3 or Avatar's box office is, but the box office for you is actually probably quite important. Maybe it's the first time you've ever sort of thought about it in that way. I don't know. But I love that story you told about the Spanish Film Festival and how it made them question their entire kind of existence.
Yeah.
I just thought, maybe you could sort of talk about that again, about a film like this entering into the film world that we're in right now, and how you kind of think about that. You know?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots going on. There was the festival rollout, and I mean, the launch of the film, which is, you know, Cannes, which is a festival completely out on its own, not because it's Cannes necessarily, but because it was that was our world premiere. So, you know, we were that was a kind of really important moment to the critical response. Yeah. Because I mean, everything sells out, so you can't go, you know, we've sold out at Cannes. It's like, well, that's based on the fact you've been selected for Cannes. That's not on the quality of the film.
Sure.
So the first look reviews coming out was such a massive thing. And I think there was, you know, it was positive with a lot of head scratching, which was kind of like the best thing, you know, to have it largely positive, but an ongoing discussion about where the hell this film sits and what is it. And, you know, it wasn't all positive. And then it went to various festivals. And because the film had sold in quite a lot of territories, I didn't go in person to as many festivals with this film as I did with Bait, where I was kind of going there to not to sell the film, but into territories where the film wasn't sold. So they did it, you know, the sales agents did everything to kind of to sell. So I was getting getting reports back from festivals. So Stitches Film Festival in Barcelona was the one that you're referring to, where there was a sort of, I think it was because there was the first screening over there was like an 8 o'clock in the morning, and people went in and watched Enys Men at 8 o'clock. And I saw a thing on Twitter which was written in Spanish, and I did a quick translate on it because it was lots of capital letters and exclamation marks. I thought, oh, this looks interesting. So I did a translate, and it said the festival programmers at whoever programmed Enys Men for 8 o'clock this morning is a terrorist and should be imprisoned, you know, something like that. And I just thought, wow, you know, that's great. And it was all of this negativity about the film, you know, and because all this negativity was coming out and this sort of controversy about it, then you got all of this sort of, the people who did like it came out really passionately positive about it. And then it led to this sort of like discussion about what the role of the festival was in light of, and it wasn't just the Enys Men screening. I think there was another film that had ruffled a few feathers. Right. So I thought, you know, that's great, brilliant to be in the middle of a discussion about it, about what, you know, where this film sits and the role of that particular film festival, or the remit of that festival, or, you know, or where this kind of a film that's kind of genre but also kind of non-narrative and kind of experimental, where it sits. And it's difficult because I'm kind of conflicted, because I want to make films that do push the boundaries a little bit, but also I'm human, so I do want everybody in the world to love the film and love what I'm doing. So there's a conflict there. And then in the box office is, this is our opening weekend, so that's really complicated as well, because I'm kind of tied into. I want to see the emails where they're talking about how many people have come to see the film, but also I don't want to be meeting up with people going and chatting money and stuff. But, you know, it is an art form that's dictated to a certain extent by market forces and economics, and I've got to be commercially viable to be able to make another film. But, you know, I'm not James Cameron, who comes out and says, right, Avatar we've got to take 2 billion at the box office for it to be commercially viable, you know. But on an incredibly scaled down version, I can't help but think, people have got to come and see it. And, you know, the thing with Bait is it had such a massive long tail and it was the word of mouth thing that was really important. And I suppose that's the thing that's more important for this film, is that the word of mouth, and as I've said in several Q&As, word of mouth can go two ways, you know. So you can wish for word of mouth, but you might get the other word of mouth where people go, no, don't go and see it. So we'll now wait for news of the cinemas holding over for week 2 and week 3. You know, that'll be the thing. But also you've got to look at it in the context of cinema audiences are down 80%. I mean, Bait did incredibly well at the box office. I think it went well over £500,000 at the UK box office, which was way above anybody's expectations. But and that film came out of nowhere. Nobody was expecting it, and so there was a buzz and a word of mouth thing. But also, that was released at a time when cinema attendances were the highest they'd been for a long time.
Sure.
And now we're at a time where we're coming back and we're at 80%. So in some ways, I'm sort of just having the film in cinemas is so exciting, because we made the film when cinemas were closed and we didn't know how many would reopen and we didn't know how many audience members would come back. But also I'm human and I'm thinking, well, you know, I've just done a preview tour where almost every date sold out. And the one that I think about most is the one that didn't sell out.
Yeah.
And it was a 5:00 screening on a Wednesday night in Newquay in a huge cinema, and it was 2/3 full.
Right.
You know,
yeah. You got to take that.
Oh God, I mean that's, you know, and when I think about it like that, that's sort of even more impressive than maybe selling out some of the other places that we've sold out on the tour. So very quickly my expectations change based on what's happening in the moment. But we've had an amazing opening weekend. You know, we're sat here in the BFI, and I just love being at the BFI South Bank to have my films on here, and to have BFI distribution doing everything that they're doing, you know, the tour that they've organised for me. And people keep saying, oh, it's, you know, I've messages from everybody saying, it's amazing, that tour you're doing must be so grueling, it's incredible that you're doing it and putting the film out there. And for me, it's just like, it's just the most pleasurable thing that I can do, and it's such a privilege to get out there. And for somebody who spends so much time saying I don't think about the audience when I'm making work, I'm at a point now where all I'm doing is interacting and thinking about the audience, and actually it's just a total joy to be in cinemas that are full of people and just go, well, you know, I'm not going to say post-pandemic, but, you know, post-lockdown, post-cinema closures, there's nothing like it. And to be in an audience is exciting. To be stood on the stage introducing your film to a packed house is just like off the scale.
Well, congratulations, my friend. We loved it, and as always, great talking to you.
Great talking to you, Dario, as well. And it's just what you're doing with this podcast is unique, and I love it.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Cheers.
Okay, so I really do hope you enjoyed that. It's always wonderful to speak to Mark, and I know he's, you know, obviously he's given a lot of press, so you can read a lot and you can listen a lot to him in different places. And I was thinking at the beginning, I said to him off mic, I'm going to try and do this interview without asking you any questions now. You know what I mean? So it was just a conversation, and I tried to keep the sort of interview, in inverted commas, questions to a minimum. So it's good to have that back and forth. The other thing I forgot to ask him about, though, was about daguerreotypes, the Agnes Varda film, because he'd literally just introduced it before he'd come and spoken to me. And I'd mentioned on Twitter that I'd watched that film as a kind of prep, because it's not an automatic film that you'd see correlated with Enys Men. But the professional interviewer that I am, I forgot to mention daguerreotypes. So apologies for anyone who wanted, you know, daguerreotypes, Enys Men crossover content. We'll have to go for that another time. But anyway, Neil, what did you make of that? And you know, what's your thoughts on Enys Men?
Where to start? I mean, I do want to kind of circle back to daguerreotypes in terms of what you took away from watching it in relation to Mark picking it. I'm interested in that, but maybe if we got time, we could cover that maybe on the bonus. Yeah, I love that conversation, and it was just a really nice conversation. You know, like, I think that you created such a nice atmosphere for him, and he's obviously very comfortable with you to actually just talk. It felt like just talking about it, not Q&A. And as you sort of alluded to there, like, he's done a lot of press, he's talked a lot, you know, but there was a kind of level of depth and nuance to the conversation, which I thought was really, really rich and rewarding, and almost in parallel to the film, like going, the repetition and the kind of the nuance of the repetition and the rhythm is really important to understanding Enys Men. Not understanding it, but to taking something out of it that's kind of touching and personal. I think as a viewer, there's it has its own rhythm and it has its own way that is kind of key to the experience. And I think that was certainly true in the conversation that you had. It was nice to hear again a reference to the roots of the podcast. I forgot that we did talk about maybe doing a Source FM radio show. I forgot about that. I completely forgot about that. Yeah. So thanks for reminding us that we wanted to be radio stars before we wanted to be podcast stars.
I know. That's hilarious.
I loved the deep dive on the sound. I thought you'd go in for the sound. When I saw the film again the other week, the cinema here in Truro cranked up the sound, which was great, and I think the sound really drives the narrative in the film. I think that, and the louder it is, the more you're aware of like what you're hearing is telling you stuff that is joining a lot of the dots in the way that the visuals are just not interested in that kind of that kind of conversation with the audience. And the deep dive on the gannet was brilliant. That process was great because that's maybe my favorite moment in the film. It's a piece of cinematic narrative foreshadowing that's all in the sound. The gannet plays no relation to the story, but the sound is so important in terms of piecing together parts of the narrative and time. So hearing more about that was great. And I think one of the times I saw it, I said to him, I heard it. I heard that smash, and it was so great. So that was really nice to hear him go into that. Little shout out when he's talking about Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. Which I think is a great documentary, not just because I've got a film in it, self-plugged, but because it really is a documentary which kind of pushes the boundaries of genre and takes its time to really say, actually, folk horror it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it does have very, very close relationships to storytelling and mythology in so many different places. It actually is part of the fabric of storytelling in a lot of what might be termed small nations, so in and I don't mean that in a derogatory term, I mean that in a kind of film industry term, places where there are small national cinemas, where there's a kind of probably a closer relationship between national identity and cinematic output, Hollywood or something like that, so Nordic countries.
Also, I was thinking, when he was talking about internationally, it just reminded me, then it popped into my head after the interview, it's like of Matty Diop's Atlantics. You know what I mean? That's, in a sense, that's folk horror, when you think about the sea and everything like that and being lost, but it's not fishermen, it's immigrants, so it's got that kind of contemporary spin on it.
And the ghosts are in the film, the ghosts, they return. There's unfinished business. I think Atlantics is actually in Woodlands Dark as well.
Right.
And I think it's really important, again, Mark's talked in the past about the authenticity of folk horror and how there's a lot that can be felt in its authenticities. And I think that it's been described as a Cornish folk horror, but I think more than that, it's specific to parts of Cornwall. And that authenticity is rooted in that real specificness, which I think is kind of one of the things that really good folk horror can tap into. You feel like you're in this place, which is, like you said there, familiar and also really jarring and puts you on edge. Because I think what the reason that folk horror puts a lot of people on edge in a really good cinematic way is because we're in a period of kind of globalization, homogenization, and this idea that everything's the same and everyone's the same. And it reminds you of the differences that are really, an important part of humanity as it's spread out across the world. So there's lots of and the other thing to mention was, obviously, I loved your sci-fi take, which you'd mentioned before, but I'd not heard you expound on it, so I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, that was very much me, and obviously Mark wouldn't be drawn on the validity of that. I think he thought that was bullshit, but that's fine. I just kind of wanted to prove that my PhD in film studies had some merit to it.
I bet within like 3 weeks of press he's talking about it as a sci-fi movie and not a horror movie.
Well, yeah, I want to write something on the DVD for that. I'm not going to have time, but do you know what I mean? It would be, this is what it really means. I mean, the other thing I think that I just didn't have time to sort of go into very much was the sort of, there's the COVID element to it, which is fairly obvious, and the way that now it suddenly becomes a reflection on the idea of time and time folding in on itself in ways that make it difficult for us to navigate our relationship to the world and each other and all of those kinds of things. But I think also, there's a real sort of environmental, not message there, but during COVID and now more and more on the news, we have to confront this idea that the possibility that we may be in a situation where we are essentially fending for ourselves, you know what I mean, trying to survive, is not beyond the realms of craziness now, of, for want of a better word, sci-fi apocalyptic futurism, you know what I mean, where it could be, it's kind of fun to look at those ideas, and yeah, they can have allegories in terms of what's going on right now, but you know, it's a serious subject now. It's kind of like, yeah, we might not be, in our lifetime, we might be facing situations where, you know, the comfortable Western lives that we've been used to are just out of the window.
Yeah, when I saw the film last and he was talking about it, he talked about the pandemic, and it was really moving, and he was clearly moved by it. And I'd never really seen it as a pandemic film. Other, you know, it was made during the pandemic, but what really struck me was he was really adamant that that the pandemic was still going on, that this is happening, that this is, you know, and I think that's really important because that's how I feel, you know, like I don't feel like we're past anything. We might have adjusted to living with something, but it doesn't feel like it's a thing of the past. It feels like it's with us in that way that the film sort of talks about time staying with us, you know. And it also made me rethink how the film is put together from the volunteers' perspective.
Sure.
You know, you were talking a lot about the Omega Man, which I thought was a really interesting thing, because when I think about the film now, I think about how we are invited to bear witness, and that she is bearing witness. Like, there's so much of the film is watching her watch and watching her see. We don't always see what she's seeing, but we know she's seeing things, and we know they're leaving an imprint. And that feels like really important, that we have to bear witness to this. We have to, like you say, that's where I think so many of the readings of the film find a home. The ecological, the hauntological, you know, whatever it is, like that there is a character there whose role in this story is to bear witness and to live through this experience. And that's what we're doing, you know. And okay, maybe the initial peak has passed, but the scars remain. The sense that was a period of time that was completely out of sync with everything else we've experienced in our lives up to that point remains. Like it's that, and that I think that will remain, you know. And I think that there is an absolute global refusal to acknowledge that it happened and how it happened and the imprint that it left on us. And I think Mark's film is a beautiful experience for capturing that feeling of what it was like and what it remains like, not just what it was like in that time, but what it remains like, to actually bear witness, and to really bear witness to such a global and personal. It was both things at once. It was deeply personal and insanely global. I think that's really struck me.
It is a reminder, and again, if you approach the film in the right way, and that sounds a little bit sort of high and mighty and righteous to say that, but what I mean by that is that it is reflecting on something that I think that we haven't recovered from yet, almost because of the nature of the capitalist system and our lives. Like the people who run the country and the people who employ us, if we're talking about sort of corporations in that sense, it's almost as if the pandemic did never happen. It was like an aberration, and now we are forced. I mean, everybody that I know looks a combination of utterly traumatized, exhausted, or just in a bad mood, bad-tempered. And like with students, it's kind of like there's a lot of anxiety still there. And the acknowledgement of that is so lacking. It's just like, no, okay, we've solved it. Get back to normal now, everyone. And it's the same thing has been going on really when we think about the environmental situation for the last 20 or 30 years. It's like either it's not happening or there's nothing we can do. So just get on with being good capitalists. And when I said that before about environmentalism as well, I don't want to sort of push to one side the fact that environmental catastrophe is already happening to a huge percentage of the globe. You know what I mean? It's just that sort of sense of us in our comfortable lives. And, thinking about a place like Cornwall or, again, when we've talked about the experience of coastal towns, that experience of isolation and being separated from monetarily the conversation and the social infrastructure for years. It's just been in plain view, and nobody really talks about it changing it with any kind of urgency or seriousness.
No, and that's where Mark's film feels like folk horror to me, because the trauma, the secrets, the tragedy, the exploitation, it's in the earth. It remains like it all over the globe. Like, you can say all that stuff, and you're right, that's exactly the narrative, but the scars remain in the earth, and it feels like the pandemic allowed people the chance and the opportunity to actually reckon with that. And to actually reckon with that is a huge thing to do, because it shapes how you see the world and how you see yourself, your own place in it, and you can't go back. The first thought I had when I left, I think the first time I saw the film, I felt like that film is always going on somewhere. Like, that film is always playing. Like, it's like a loop. It feels like a loop.
Yeah.
We join it at a point and we leave it at a point, but that film is always playing somewhere. And that feeling has only grown the more I watch it. That we are bearing witness to something which is generational, geological, and the volunteer becomes a layer in that. And I just think it's immensely powerful to reckon with in a film where there's nothing there for you unless you are willing to extrapolate from it. Beautifully so, in that really cinematic way, where the more he talks about it and the more I see it, the more I kind of see where he's coming from. And there are points where audiences will join that, but there's also so many points in it where you will connect with it, and I think people won't. I think, and a lot of reason that people won't connect with it is because they don't want to acknowledge what it's potentially saying to them. As much as people won't just like it, and that's fair, but I think that there will be a lack of engagement because it's quite profound, I think, when you sit with it.
Yeah, I mean, and also, there's the basics of it with a lot of cinema these days. If it hasn't got a plot, then people are like, yeah, I'm not interested, you know what I mean? So obviously that has to be gotten over. But I think, when I spoke to Mark, that there is a possibility that sense of cinema being more than just delivery of entertainment information may be coming around again a little bit more. But again, maybe I'm being naive there. But I mean, it's interesting with it. It's not a film that's lacking in hope, because I think there is a reading of the end that is hopeful. There is a reading, like you say, though, that is a sort of reset, that this cycle is just going to start again. But there is a hopeful reading of the ending too.
Well, I think there's a hope in that as well, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's a hope of acknowledging, okay, this is the truth of our life and our planet.
Yeah.
This is where we sit within it. That doesn't mean almost kind of liberating to acknowledge the power of that. Yeah. And I think as well, like it looks incredible.
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
It sounds amazing. Mary's phenomenal in it. Like, it's a great piece of cinema. So yeah, definitely ticks those boxes as well.
Sure. And you've got to, I mean, to be honest, again, it sort of goes without saying, but if you can go to the cinema, catch it while it's out. So yeah, that's it. That's our first episode back. Neil, it's great to have you back on board, and looking forward to the episodes that are upcoming. We have our BFI Kurosawa season collaboration coming up next, so that'll be in the first week of February. The Kurosawa season is ongoing at the BFI, and the 4K restoration of Rashomon is out on general release. I think it's at a lot of cinemas, isn't it? So yeah, it might be the one that you can catch. But also, if you're subscribed to BFI Player, there's loads of Kurosawa on there. So if you want to swat up before you listen to our next episode, then I recommend that.
Yeah, don't worry, we're not covering everything because there's too much. But yeah, looking forward to revisiting Kurosawa because it was one of our earliest episodes. So this was a nice opportunity to go back in and touch on maybe different aspects to what we touched on before. And you're back at the BFI for that interview. So you, like Jenks, that'll be your second home soon, doing all of the podcasts.
Yeah, tell me about it. I'll be
base camp.
My second visit to the green room. I might get a VIP membership. You never know. But yeah, that's it. Please come and join us on our after party now. We're just going to have a quick 15-20 minutes unedited Shooting the Breeze chats about various things, maybe a couple of other films, what we did over Christmas, that kind of thing. But until next time, this has been the Cinematologists podcast. Thanks for listening.